On 12th of February 1837, at a cataract on the Upper Burbus, Robert Schomburgk watched a canoe enter the white water. The instruments had already been taken out. The provisions were in another boat. The danger on paper had been reduced. Then the Coriol struck the surge, turned, and threw 13 men into the current. One of them was Charles F. Rice, 22 years old. Schomburgk's published diary says they searched for 2 hours before they found him. The next morning, they buried him above the flood line, opposite the place where he had drowned. That is the human opening of this expedition. But the object this episode follows is not a body in the river, it is a lake on a map. For more than 2 centuries, European maps had carried a great inland water in Guyana. It had been moved, enlarged, renamed, doubted, defended, and copied. By the time Schomburgk went inland for the Royal Geographical Society, the lake had the look of geography because generations of map makers had treated it like geography. The question is simple enough to hold the whole case. How did a lake that was not there survive on European maps for more than 2 centuries, and why did its removal also become part of imperial history? Schomburgk did not find the lake. He helped show how it had been drawn. The Royal Geographical Society did not send him to Guyana to chase a romance. In 1835, it backed a practical survey of British Guiana's interior, supported by imperial money and colonial interest. The colony needed rivers measured, routes described, resources named, and boundaries made legible. That mission matters. It changes the story from adventure to paperwork with blood in it. The reports keep returning to instruments: chronometer, sextant, compass, artificial horizon, barometer, chain. The language is not a chase, it is measurement. And that is what makes the inherited map so dangerous. A fantasy drawn in the same visual language as a river begins to look like the river. A copied outline begins to look like evidence. A rumor, once engraved, becomes easier to believe than a blank space. Before Schomburgk enters the story, the lake is already old. Spanish reports, Raleigh's account, missionary geography, indigenous route information, local water bodies, flooded savannas, and hearsay from several frontiers had been folded together by European cartographers. On paper, those fragments hardened into Lake Parime and its attached city, Manoa. That is the part of the popular story that can mislead. If the episode becomes a search for a hidden city, the map stays innocent. The viewer waits for a discovery that never comes. The better drama is harsher. Europe had drawn a target, then sent surveyors into real rivers to see whether the target deserved to exist. You can imagine the old map as a piece of evidence that has already made up its mind. The lake is not penciled in as a question. It sits there with a shoreline. It has a place. It has a name. It asks the expedition to behave as if the answer is somewhere ahead. The old map asked one question: where is the lake? Schomburgk's report slowly asked a better one: what real things were mistaken for it? The geography can be simplified into 3 movements. First, Schomburgk pushed inland through the river systems already known through Amerindian travel and colonial traffic. Second, he turned to the Corentyne and Burbus, where cataracts made measurement a bodily ordeal. Third, he moved toward the highlands and the root systems that older maps had filled with conjectural water. Follow those lines one by one, and the expedition stops looking like a list of names. It becomes a map being tested one section at a time. Line 1, into the interior. Line 2, up the cataract rivers. Line 3, toward the old lake country. The printed Burbus diary begins with a failed route. Schomburgk says the Corentyne ascent had been frustrated by short provisions, what he described as deception and cataracts. So he turned to the Burbus. On 25 November 1836, he left New Amsterdam with 4 Coriols. His boat cruise, he wrote, consisted of Arawaks, Waros, and 3 Caribs. That sentence changes the authorship of the journey. The map was published under Schomburgk's name. The movement of the expedition was not his alone. The Royal Geographical Society report gives the European author. It also lets us see, in flashes, the people whose knowledge and labor made the report possible: canoemen, guides, carriers, interpreters, settlements, paths, portages, river names. The routes were not discovered from nothing. They were entered through existing networks. The colonial record turns those networks into assistance. I read that as one of the central absences in the file. The map that corrected Europe was partly made from indigenous geography, but the printed authority remained European. Then the Burbus becomes physical. The river narrows. Cataracts break the channel. The canoes have to be unloaded. Baggage goes overland. Crews drag corials over stone. Schomburgk writes that at one point 2 hours carried them only 100 yards. This is where the lake on the map starts to cost something. Not because the lake is real, because proving the map wrong requires bodies in the current, hands on ropes, loads on shoulders, and instruments kept dry long enough to turn danger into coordinates. Every portage is a small argument with the map. Every delayed mile says the printed line was easier than the country beneath it. At the Christmas cataracts, Rice stood in the coriol as it approached the fall. Schomburgk wrote that prudence should have told him to sit. The bow struck the surge. The boat overturned. 13 men went into the water. Rice disappeared below the rapid. The report fixes the date, place, and name. 12-year February 1837, Christmas cataracts, Charles F. Race, drowned after a coriol overturned. A later summary sometimes attaches a different death to this case. Theodore Schomburgk on the Cuyuni. The opened Burbus report does not support that version. It names Rice, gives the date, and describes the accident. What the report records next is burial, not spectacle. A hammock for a shroud, a grave above the flood, a tablet fixed to a tree. Then the expedition continues. That is the hard arithmetic of survey work. A death can stop a paragraph without stopping the project. And this is where Rice has to stay connected to the main story. He did not die for the romance people later attached to Guyana. He died inside the work of turning uncertain geography into an official map. Before that death, the same Burbus journey had produced the object London preferred to remember. On the upper river, Schomburgk saw a giant water lily, leaves 5 or 6 feet across, tray-shaped, green above and crimson below, with a flower of many petals. The Journal of the Royal Geographical Society attached the plant to the name Victoria Regia. A copy of the engraving was presented to Queen Victoria. The lily was perfect for London. It was huge. It was visible. It could be drawn, named, admired, and made royal. The lily was real. The lake was not. That contrast is the first clean turn in the episode. The record does not deny wonder. It locates it. The Burbus lily had a river, a date, a measured leaf, and a printed botanical discussion. The great inland lake had copied outlines and inherited authority. One survived measurement, the other began to fail under it. By the third expedition, the map itself becomes the antagonist. Schomburgk moved through the region where older European maps had left room for a large inland water. The reports become less like a quest and more like a sequence of corrections. A river appears on maps where local testimony and travel do not support it. A confluence is found south of its usual printed position. A watershed behaves differently from the inherited diagram. Names fixed in European print begin to loosen when checked against current, direction, portage, and guide. The map was not being improved by adding a discovery. It was being improved by removing one. This is the middle question of the episode. Why did the lake ever look findable? The answer is not that every earlier witness lied. Some reports seem to have described flooded savannas. Some pointed toward Lake Amuku. Some recorded seasonal water, river connections, or indigenous terms that outsiders misunderstood. Some mixed route intelligence with colonial hearsay. Cartographers then gave those fragments a stable shape. A seasonal flood became a permanent lake. A local water body became a continental feature. A route story became an object. That is how repetition becomes a machine. The first map makes a guess. The second map copies it. The third map inherits both the guess and the confidence. After enough copying, removing the lake feels more aggressive than leaving it alone. This is how the lake became real on paper. First a rumor, then a line, then a shoreline, then a fact copied by people who had never seen the country. Schomburgk's survey did something less spectacular and more damaging. It replaced the grand shape with smaller, stubborn things that could be checked. On the old sheet, the lake could be seen at once. On the survey sheet, its replacement was harder to admire. A bend in one river, a portage between two waters, a dry season lake that shrank, a floodplain that changed with the rains. The correction looked less impressive because it was closer to the ground. Schomburgk's crucial decision was not a dramatic turn at one river fork. It was slower and more useful. He treated the inherited map as a suspect document. Once he did that, every coordinate became testimony. The question was no longer whether the expedition could reach the old lake. The question was whether the old lake could survive the expedition. The answer was no. But this does not make Schomburgk a lone truth-teller walking into a blank world. That would be another myth. The 1840 sketch map of British Guiana, published by John Arrowsmith and now catalogued by the Library of Congress, shows the result of Schomburgk's surveys and the boundary claims they helped generate. It belongs to a political afterlife as much as a scientific one. The same work that removed a mythical lake also made Guiana more legible to London. Schomburgk corrected a European error, but he did it through a colonial survey machine that translated local routes into imperial paper. D. Graham Burnett's study of British Guiana makes the problem hard to miss. 19th century geographic knowledge in these expeditions was entangled with colonial reconnaissance and administration, and the expedition parties were hybrid in composition as well as purpose. So the story cannot end with Europe becoming wiser. It has to end with the map's double life, the false lake removed, the territorial claim strengthened. Here is what we know. We know the sponsors, we know the route, we know the cruise, we know the lily, we know the death, we know the correction. The Royal Geographical Society sponsored Schomburgk's Guiana expeditions between 1835 and 1839. The Burbus ascent left New Amsterdam on 25th of November 1836. The boat's crews included Arawaks, Waros, and Caribs. Schomburgk recorded the giant water lily on the Burbus, and the printed discussion attached it to the name Victoria Regia. Charles F. Rice drowned at the Christmas cataracts on 12th of February 1837. Later reports corrected rivers, route relationships, and watershed assumptions in the region where the old lake had been placed. The old lake no longer explained the country the survey described. Here is what we do not know. We do not have the expedition told by the people who knew the country before it became a British map. Akawayo, Makusi, Wapisiana, Arawak, Waro, Carib, Aracuna, and other indigenous participants appear mostly through European sentences. The record gives us names and functions more often than voices. That gap is not decorative. It changes how the map should be read. A European map lost a false lake. An imperial map gained usable routes. The people who knew those routes did not gain equal authorship over the printed result. By 1840, the expedition had two clean public faces. One was the flower, made royal. The other was the map, made official. Both were easier to display than the labor behind them. The old lake did not vanish all at once. Myths rarely do when they have had 2 centuries of engraved confidence. Later references could still make Lake Parime feel like a place waiting to be found, not an error waiting to be removed. That delay is part of the story, but the safer claim is also the stronger one. Schomburgk's reports made the old lake unnecessary before the popular imagination was ready to let it go. The fatal assumption had 2 layers. In the field, it was the assumption that a marked object on the map represented a recoverable object on the ground. In the archive, it was the assumption that repetition was evidence. Earlier expeditions had not located something that later surveys failed to find. They had helped create a map object that later surveys had to unmake. That is why the competing theories are narrower than the legend suggests. One answer is that Lake Parime was pure invention, a blank filled by greed and repetition. That explains the confidence, but not the real water features that kept confusing outsiders. A better answer is that several real things were fused. Lake Amuku, seasonal flooding of the Rupununi savannas, river connections, indigenous words for large water, and second-hand reports carried from one frontier to another. The modern geological question, whether older lake systems existed in parts of northern Brazil or the Amazon basin, does not rescue the 16th and 17th century map lake. A prehistoric basin is not the same as the lake European maps placed in Guyana with Manoa attached. Schomburgk's Guyana surveys did not fail because he missed the legendary lake. They succeeded because he made the lake unnecessary. The expedition's most important result was a negative result made useful. The place on the map where a Great Lake had been drawn could be explained by smaller waters, seasonal floods, older hearsay, copied error, and the route knowledge of people the official record treated as secondary. That is a strange kind of expedition ending. No wreck, no final camp, no vanished party. The disappearance belongs to the object being sought. The lake disappears under measurement, but the map remains the motif because it did two things at once. It corrected a myth and it served an empire. The final line of the case is not only that the legend was false, the final line is that the false lake survived because maps can preserve an assumption longer than a witness can preserve a correction. The lake was not lost, it was drawn.